So functions and methods. These are routines that let us manipulate objects. They're routines that we write to manipulate objects. And I'm going to ground the discussion mainly using methods, since we're approaching C++ as an object-oriented language. We will need to define functions for doing some things, but most of the routines that we write are going to be methods, or sometimes people will call them member functions. But you know, the big difference between a method and a function is methods are directly associated with classes and objects. And this is one meaning of encapsulation, where we have the data that make up an object, and we also have in this class the routines or the methods that define the ways in which we can manipulate the object and its properties. So at some level, and this is not a strictly true statement, but you know, if you have, let's say that I'm averaging a bunch of grades for a bunch of students in the class, right? And I can certainly break this down into, you know, reading and summing grades. For student 1, let's say. And then I can compute the average and print it. So then I have to do exactly the same through. So you know, if I express this as a sequence, what you'll see is that I have to do exactly the same thing. Whoops. For each student in the class. And in fact, you know, what I'm doing here is I'm just writing the same sequence of statements over and over and over. I would have to do this, you know, for however many students I have, for n students. But it's really the same thing. And what I could do is I could, and of course the operation here is exactly the same for each student, for student 1, for student 3, and so on and so forth. So what I could do is I could simply write this routine one time, and then I can just give it students information. I mean, there's nothing particular about this operation for student 1 versus student 2. They're all the same operations. So what I could do is I could, you know, create a routine or a function or a method, whoops, or a procedure that simply averages grades regardless of who the student is. And now what I can do is that for each student I'll just simply I'll simply use that procedure for each student. Now the advantage of this is that I am writing this code only one time, but I can use it n times. And so that's another thing about putting code into some sort of a package that we can use over and over and over, right? And depending on which programming paradigm you're working in or what language you're working in, it may be called a procedure, it may be called, and so certainly in object-oriented circles we use the term method or member function. I tend to use the word method. So first of all, methods, and again, this goes back to encapsulation. This associates operations with classes and objects. in some languages, so for example in C and imperative languages, methods are not really associated in quite the same way with the objects that they manipulate. And they let us, they're the main way that we manipulate objects. And I know manipulate is a very abstract statement, but I'm using that intentionally. Manipulation could just be retrieving some property, some value. It could be changing that value. It could be summing grades. It could be averaging grades. It could be, whoops, sorry about that. So very general manipulation. And also it lets us write code once. So I'm going to be able to write code once, but I'll be able to use it often. And, and this gets into an issue of code maintenance, right? Let's say that I discover, well, just like I did here, I discovered that I forgot to write the word average. And I had to make 2 changes. And if I had continued this exercise for all n of my students, I would have had to write the word average n times. But if I've only written this statement one time and I keep referring to it through a routine, then I only have to make 1 change. So from a code maintenance standpoint, if I do make a coding error in a routine, I only have to change that routine. I don't have to go looking for every single place where I've cut and pasted that code and then make those changes.